I've got a guy who works for the FBI right now through the human trafficking. You guys know that Houston is the biggest harbor for human trafficking in the United States, specifically for like sex slaves. So he's really heard about the Apollo lectures. He's super excited about coming. To this week's theme, we're hoping to meet every other week here in the LGI. We're going to start around 3, we're going to end around 4:15, 4:30, depending on how long everybody's lecture is. And really, we're just here to tell stories and tell good lectures. And this week's theme is about motivation. And motivation is something that I've been interested in a lot. Ms. Roveno at the beginning of the year had 2 expectations of her teachers. She said she wanted to make sure that we had high expectations in class. That regardless of the level you were in, whether you're taking an academic class or an advanced placement, an AP class, or an honors class, because I know we've got our dual, whatever it was, that we were challenging you as much as possible. Not just for a test, but because this district really cares deeply about making sure that you guys are college ready. And what does that mean? That you walk in freshman year and you don't totally freak out and think, oh my gosh, I didn't learn anything in high school. So our first expectation for Ms. Roveno was that we had high expectations. But the second one, and the one that really intrigued me, is she wanted to make sure that you were engaged. And that's a word that's become kind of a dirty word for teachers, because teachers interpret that to mean entertain. And a lot of teachers take offense to that because we're not entertainers. We have a college degree, and sometimes we don't get paid like we have a college degree, but we want to engage you in your learning. We want to make sure that you understand the context of what you're learning. We want to make sure that it's relevant to your lives, so that it's not just something you're checking off, like high school, got it, move on to the next one, but it's something that you can really, lessons that you can take and apply in your community. So, motivation, I read a book, Daniel Pink. I'd love to let you borrow it, but I have a student. Who has it? Danny, you have it? Does he? Jesse might have it, but Daniel Pink wrote, the first book he wrote was called A Whole New Mind, which I loved because I was a big English and theater geek, and his whole thesis is that the jobs of tomorrow are really important to have a creative mind, right? That the jobs of tomorrow aren't the jobs that your parents had or the jobs that your grandparents had, that the world is changing and it's looking for flexible people that are willing to try new things, make mistakes, and use critical thinking skills. So in his second book, Drive, he talks specifically about motivation. And what he does is he defines these 2 concepts, the concept of extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And our goal, I would hope as teachers, is to intrinsically motivate you or to help you find the intrinsic value of learning, of being a good student, right? So what is extrinsic motivation? Extrinsic motivation is when there's some sort of external factor that's motivating you to be better. And he doesn't say that these are like the extrinsic motivation is bad. These are very real motivators in a lot of your lives today. You know, getting a promotion, getting a raise at work, that significantly changes the way a family, can survive and live comfortably. Working hard to make sure you don't get fired, that's another reality of our community here at Atascocita High School. It's something that we went through last year. There were a lot of teachers that weren't sure they were going to have a job the very next year. But these are all extrinsic motivators, right? Daniel Pink calls this the carrot and the stick theory. And so his big question was, how useful is extrinsic motivation and how useful is intrinsic motivation? And he starts off by defining 2 types of tasks, or what he says are the skills of tomorrow, right? An algorithmic task is a task that has very specific instructions. You have to do 1 before you do 2. You have to do 2 before you do 3, and so on and so forth, right? So let's think of like a cashier. And he asked the question, does extrinsic motivation help somebody like a cashier? And what they found is that it does. If you tell a cashier, if you can check people out twice as fast and give you a raise, the cashiers get better at their algorithmic task. If you tell a cashier, if you don't double the amount of time you're checking people out, we're going to fire you, that does help them check out faster. But if you think about heuristic tasks, which are tasks or skills that require creative puzzle problem solving, the ability to adapt to a situation, to be flexible, to look for new information, to seek help in the right places. Extrinsic motivation, and you can read all of the psychological experiments that it goes through in the book Drive, completely works against heuristic tasks. Now you tell me, what are the jobs of tomorrow? Because every time we turn on the news, we hear about another job that's outsourced, another algorithmic task that's outsourced to another country. It's a lot cheaper for Dell to have a call center in India than it is to have one here in the United States. So how are we motivating you to have creative thinking, to have critical thinking skills, to have problem-solving skills? How are we really preparing you for a tomorrow? If you guys think about it, you're going to be retiring, what, to 2080, 2075, some of you guys? What does that world look like? I mean, when I started middle school, my dad had the big clunky computer, and it was the first time we had internet. I've seen the expansion of internet. Any of you guys have Ms. Roberts in here? Ms. Roberts, she's a technology teacher here. She was my emerging technology teacher at Atascocita Middle School. And I'll never forget when she was like, when you guys get older, you're going to sit at your desks with these pads that are electronic and wireless, and you're going to be able to write each other messages. And I'm like, this woman's crazy. And now we've got iPads, right? So what does the world look like tomorrow with skills are being needed? Right? So what motivates you today? Why are you here at school? Why are you doing a good job in school? Is it because the law says you have to be here? Or is it because you're playing the game? Are you here to get the GPA? How many extrinsic motivators do you have on a daily basis when you enter this building? Right? And we've kind of sold you a lie, haven't we? Like, get good grades, make sure you're in the top 10%, and now if you want to go to UT, you better make sure you're in the top 8%, or you're not going to go to college, and you're going to die alone. That is the corner, right? But what's on the other side of UT? Because right now, and I graduated from St. Edward's University. I graduated from St. Edward's University 6 years ago. And I have plenty of friends that have their shiny $120,000 degree and no jobs. How many people in here know somebody, a sibling, an aunt or an uncle, a neighbor that has a college degree and cannot currently find a job? How many people in here? I know 5. How many of you guys know a college graduate that's living with their parents? This one, right here, living with mom and dad. So what's on the other side of school for you guys? And what does that mean? How are we going to continue to sell this extrinsic lie that if you come here and you get good grades and you go to college, there's, the happy pot of love at the end of the rainbow? This is a picture I took last year at the rally in Austin about supporting education and trying to prevent further cuts to education. And this is a teacher. She said the most bittersweet moment of her life was the year that she won Teacher of the Year. The week before she won Teacher of the Year, she received a notice that she wasn't going to have a job the next day. And teaching, what's funny is that it's always been perceived as this job that, it's okay if you can't find anything else, you can go into teaching, which I find kind of personally insulting. But even teaching isn't a place that you can rely that's going to be there. Even those jobs are kind of scary to come by now. So extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Daniel Pink says that you need 3 things to intrinsically motivate people to do anything better. You have to communicate purpose, you have to give autonomy, and what that means is give people the liberty and the freedom to do their task in their way, at their pace, in the way that they can. And you have to expect mastery. You have to have very, very high expectations. So Ms. Ravenio has already hit at least one of those for us. She does expect mastery. We do expect mastery, and classes at Atascocita are difficult, and I think we take pride in that as teachers. But how much of this can we provide in a classroom setting? How many times do we really make connections and explain to you guys, this is why you need to understand diction and tone? How many times do we create relevancy and connotation in your life? And so I started thinking about what intrinsically motivates me to learn when there are no stakes. When are the times in my life when I'm not going to get paid, there's no sticker, there's no extra credit, or professional development hours? And I listen to NPR a lot. And so you listen to This American Life? Beautiful, wonderful stories. You can download the podcast. You can go to thisamericanlife.com and listen to amazing stories. And I'm learning just for the sake of learning. There's another program, The Mob. These podcasts are really cool. It's all stories, real people. Sometimes you get Malcolm Gladwell. The other day I heard a podcast from a 7-year-old. They're all between 10 and 15 minutes. But there's something in the power of the story we reach a depth of understanding when we hear a story that we don't necessarily get when something is just defined for us. And how many of us have had to sit in a class, sometimes at no fault of the teacher, where you're flying so fast, all you're really covering is denotation, all you're really covering are facts. We've all been, I mean, I've been there as a teacher. It's like, oh, Tone, you like it? You're good, we're moving on, right? And TED Talks, of course. How many people here have seen TED Talks? How many of you have no idea what a TED Talk is? When I would get really tired, and this is my confession time, on a Friday I'd have TED Fridays. My students can tell you, we've had TED Fridays. And there's always a deep theme, or something's defined, or an interesting puzzle is presented through a TED Talk, and for 20 minutes, my students are not asking me to go to the bathroom. They're not, pulling out their phones to see what time it is. I have real engagement. So there's definitely times throughout school that you are intrinsically motivated to learn.